Imagine traveling in a small metal boat with 35 other young people of your age. In the distance, you hear gunfire and shouts. And even though you know the type of enemy you're facing, as you approach the beach, fear clouds your senses. Suddenly, it's time to disembark. The frenzy of your comrades pushes you to jump onto the beach stained with blood and filled with the remains of other fallen soldiers. Young people like you and your colleagues. From the hills, the fire of German machine guns greets you as a promise of death, as certain as it is painful. It's time to run for your life and fight for the fate of the Allied forces. Scenes like that were experienced by millions of men on the shores of Normandy on June 6, 1944, during the most important and famous military landing in history, D-Day. Whether seen as an unparalleled offensive strategy or a turning point in the fight against Nazi Germany, the initial day of Operation Overlord continues to fascinate the world. Today, we invite you to get to know some soldiers who put their lives on the line during that historic event. Throughout the video, you will learn their names, see their faces, and, above all, hear their experiences. Join us in another exciting installment of military history. On July 25, 2022, a 102-year-old man named Sherwin Callander passed away in his native Alabama. Perhaps his name is not familiar to you, but the experiences of this old U.S. Army soldier are directly linked to the fate of the entire planet during the 20th century. Sherwin was one of the thousands of souls who, on June 6, 1944, landed on the shores of northern France to deliver a mortal blow to the German defenses. No great military feat can be accomplished without sweat and blood. And this Allied victory was no exception. The troops faced some of the most hostile theaters in history. We could tell you about the more than 3 million soldiers who fought in that region between July and August 1944. The thousands of tanks and machine guns used by Germany, and the countless landing craft left stranded on the sands of Omaha. But there is another way to understand this history, and it is through the memories and experiences of men like Callander. Remarkably, Sherwin was also present at the outset of Uncle Sam's involvement in the global conflict. On December 6, 1941, the sailor was en route to Midway Island when, from his vessel, he spotted the silhouette of an immense ship that he and his comrades initially mistook for the USS Enterprise. It later turned out to be one of the numerous aircraft carriers from which the attack on Pearl Harbor was launched. Due to his proximity to the catastrophe, Callander found himself engaged in the operations to rescue the wounded and recover bodies in the waters of the Pacific. From that moment onward, the soldier's destiny became intertwined with combating the Axis, ultimately leading him to Normandy 3.5 years later.
The first wave I was on, and not a man survived out of that. We had over 100 feet of clear beach, maybe close to 200, before you could get any shelter. And the Germans was up on the hills bombarding us.
In his memoirs, Sherwin also recalls that the water off the coast turned completely red. There were so many lifeless bodies piling up on the sand that the doors of the landing craft violently opened over those remains. Those who were still alive had no choice but to advance through the fallen comrades decorating that infernal landscape. Keep in mind that, while Operation Overlord was intended to be a mortal blow to the Axis forces, it depended on a colossal effort and the sacrifice of thousands of lives to break through the initial defenses. The attack was launched on 5 different assault beaches and required the unparalleled coordination of amphibious and airborne forces. The American soldiers knew that a fierce enemy awaited in the hills, but they did not expect such a massacre. The firing rate of machine guns like the legendary MG-42, also known as Hitler's buzzsaw, was a constant danger with about 1,200 rounds per minute. Although this beast consumed too many cartridges to sustain fire for more than a few seconds, each burst ended the lives of at least a few Allied soldiers. Many veterans who fought in Normandy remember brave men reduced to tears by the pain, fear, and violence experienced in the course of a few hours. Such an effort was necessary to liberate northwestern Europe. As Callender noted in his testimony, the first wave was the most brutal, as they were the spearhead that opened the corridor through which the rest of the landings passed. Regarding that battle, Sherwin had no doubts about the place that experience occupied in his military career.
It was mean. That was the worst battle I believe I was in.
Similar story is told by Jake Larson, the last survivor of the 135th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Army's 34th Division. But his narration doesn't begin on the beaches of northern France. It starts in a small cinema in his native Minnesota when he went to see a Gene Autry cowboy movie. The problem was that when Jake and his friend arrived at the theater, they realized they didn't have the 10 cents it cost to enter. Near the theater was a recruitment office. So motivated by boredom, both decided to enlist in the National Guard, where they would earn $12 per quarter, enough to no longer worry about the price of a movie ticket. We can fast forward to that mythical day, June 6, 1944, when Jake Larson, along with hundreds of thousands of men, landed on the beaches of Normandy. The enemy was ahead, in a favorable position and armed with machine guns capable of firing thousands of rounds per minute. However, the young man survived to tell his story and returned to that place many years later. In June 2019, 75 years after this monumental event that changed his life and that of the entire planet, Jake Larson stepped on the beaches of Omaha again. The young man who couldn't afford to watch a Western in the cinema never imagined reaching 96 years old, let alone going through such hell. According to his own words, the place looks very different today.
The sea here is clear. It was bloody, bodies. What can a person say now, except that war is hell?
Larson remembers being one of the first to leave the small landing craft, and when he descended, the water reached his neck, so he had to advance with the rifle above his head. To avoid being blown to pieces by stepping on a landmine, he followed the path marked by soldiers who arrived before him. Years later, he recalled, "The Germans filled the place with obstacles, traps. When we reached the beach, there was machine gun fire from all directions. It was not a walk." Larson's experience allows us to delve into one of the most interesting military objects of D-Day, one that you may have already noticed in series and movies on the subject. The advance on the coast of Normandy was made with a type of boat known as LCVP, short for landing craft, vehicle personnel, although most soldiers called it the Higgins boat. Its silhouette became an icon of that day. In many photos and recreations of the bloody landing, the LCVPs play a central role, as without them, the risky strategy would have been totally impossible. The design of the Higgins boats was inspired by barges used in swamps, and a total of 8 were built. In their 11 meters in length and 3.4 meters in width, up to 36 members of a platoon could fit. It was also possible to transport a jeep with 12 people, or the equivalent of 3.6 tons of cargo. The idea of advancing at 22 kilometers per hour Its top speed, toward a beach full of enemies armed with the best of the German arsenal, is terrifying. Only soldiers like Jake Larson know what it feels like to be in that long stretch between the main ships and solid ground. Of course, the LCVPs were equipped with 7.62mm Browning machine guns, but even so, turbulence, adrenaline, and risk were the order of the day. Regarding horror, Larson also has a story to add to the mosaic of accounts that make up D-Day. As the young soldier advanced ashore, escaping the German fire coming from above, he recalls stopping for a second and asking a comrade for matches to light a cigarette. Not receiving a response, he turned to repeat the request, and that's when Jake saw horror up close.
I looked again, and there was no head under the helmet. The soul of that boy inspired me to up at that instant and run for the cliff.
Despite the hardships he endured, Larson survived without serious consequences, allowing him to go through his old age without bodily pains, beyond the expected aches in a nearly 100-year-old body. On several occasions, he wanted to return to the beaches of Normandy to close the chapter on his memories, but unfortunately, the U.S. Army rejected the request to finance his trip to France as his documentation and service records were lost in the 1970s, an institutional shortcoming much more common than you might imagine. That's why his close friends started a collection to fund a journey not only to Europe, but also to the past, to those beaches that changed the life of a young man from Minnesota forever. Although they never formally met, at the same time that Larson ran on the beaches of Omaha, another young American soldier was fighting in that same area. His name was Onorio Zikani, a humble son of shoemakers who was recruited to participate in the world conflict as the situation began to worsen. Initially, the recruit was confident that he would be sent to the African campaign, where the famous General Patton was, as seen in television reports. Once his ship headed for Scotland, and considering that his 6-month training consisted of operating boats and beaches, he realized he had been prepared for a maritime assault on the European continent. And it wasn't just any offensive, it was the largest operation in history. Like the other testimonies we've explored throughout the video, Zikani recalls total chaos upon reaching land. He was not in the first waves, so when he arrived, there were already many dead floating in the water. The curious thing is that Onorio was not afraid to die. As a practicing Christian, death was not one of his concerns. He believed that if it was his time to go, he should accept it with gallantry. Still, the sands of Omaha held images that he could never let go of.
This GI was sitting in a corner, and they're sitting on his helmet. He was a redhead. I'll never forget him. And he was holding his guts. He was just torn apart, and he was holding his guts like this. And he kept saying, "I'm going home, I'm going home, I'm going home." And I said, "I wish you luck. I don't know if you made it or not."
The difficulty of forgetting those brutal hours of the landing is very common among veterans of this battle. The passage of years can erase many things, but the psychological wounds they received in northern France left noticeable and painful scars. Men like Onorio Zikani may forget important aspects of their past, but the faces and names of their fallen comrades on D-Day remain as clear and vivid as on June 6, 1944. Moving on to physical injuries, medical attention took a long time to be effective on the battlefield. The German fire from the hills prevented doctors from doing their job. A laceration as brutal as the one described by Onorio was impossible to address on the spot. But the fate of the young redhead had been sealed for a long time. Zikani himself experienced the painful kiss of German projectiles. when he tried to take cover under an overturned landing craft, he was hit in the leg. Fortunately, he fully recovered, although his injuries were not properly cared for, which later complicated receiving the appropriate honors as a combat wounded veteran.
There's never made a report. There's never a medical report. I didn't go to what they call sick call every morning. Now, who the hell is going to go to sick call every morning in Normandy? You know what I mean?
Fortunately, the humble son of shoemakers also managed to return to the place where he experienced his greatest hardships, to put an end to those experiences. In 2019, Onorio toured those beaches that had caused him so much pain in the past, now as a respected veteran and decorated with the Purple Heart, after years of fighting to have his battlefield wounds recognized. Of course, the trip to France would not have been complete without a visit to the cemetery where hundreds of young people who did not survive the confrontation rest. Zikani recognized some names written on the crosses. In his memories, they were all heroes. Wave after wave, Allied troops continued to arrive on the beaches of Normandy. Although more than 10,000 deaths were recorded on the first day, the Allied front managed to deposit 150,000 men. That far exceeded Germany's defensive capabilities. It cost a lot of blood, but the legendary landing was victorious. As we mentioned at the beginning of the video, the history of great military feats can be known not only through numbers and grandiose data, but also by traveling through the memories of men who carried out these titanic efforts, crossing the water stained with red, pushing the lifeless bodies of their comrades, and ignoring physical pain to defeat a deadly enemy. June 6, 1944, the Allies launch Operation Overlord, better known as the Battle of Normandy, and begin the liberation of Europe. The days of Nazism are numbered, and the final chapter of the brutal war will soon arrive. The memory of the naval landing on the French coast has been engraved in the memory of the entire world. But what is not known is that that mission could not have been carried out without the huge airborne invasion that paved the way. On this occasion, we will focus on that part of the events, and particularly on the odyssey that the 517th Parachute Regiment of the United States went through, from its violent landing on European soil to the fierce clashes with the Germans on the way to Berlin to finish off Adolf Hitler. If you want to relive all the action in which these troops participated, then stay with us, because we are about to go through a new page of military history. The planning for D-Day was unprecedented in scale and complexity. The Germans had occupied France 4 years earlier, in June 1940, and despite the efforts of the resistance, the Nazis had the capabilities to control the country without much effort. For this reason, the operation called for American, British, and Canadian divisions to land on 5 beaches, covering approximately 95 kilometers of coastline in the Normandy region. However, those in charge of putting together the plan determined that an amphibious assault alone would not be enough, and that is why the airborne regiments were an important part of the mission. Their role was to seize several roads behind the coast, to prevent the Germans from reinforcing the coastal defenses, and to create the conditions for the advance of the Allied troops. The participation of these soldiers began on the night of June 5th, during the hours before the landing. More than 13,000 American paratroopers boarded C-47s for the largest airborne operation in history. However, trouble began when they crossed into France and encountered a cloud bank over the Cotentin Peninsula. Because of this, most of the pilots climbed or dived, But that was not the only obstacle, as they soon encountered a destructive burst of anti-aircraft fire that forced the fleet to disperse. In the resulting chaos, the crews bailed out of their aircraft, far from their intended location. Most of the airborne soldiers landed without any idea of where they were. In the darkness, the men of these divisions mingled and fought dozens of small battles across a vast territory as they advanced through the French countryside. Confused by the number of open fronts, the Germans wasted time trying to decide where to direct their counterattacks, and that contributed to the Allies' ultimate objective. The flashes of rifles illuminated the darkness before the sun rose in the sky. Screams and moans of pain were camouflaged among the sound of gunfire, and blood was pouring out from everywhere. That moment was truly brutal, where the enemy soldiers saw each other face to face and only thought of killing before being killed. In any case, this was not a one-day operation, and in fact, to know the fate of our protagonists, we must advance to August 15th, 1944, when the forces determined to end the Nazi occupation carried out another landing, but this time in Provence. The first attack had been from the north with the deployment in Normandy, and while a brutal battle broke out to force the soldiers of the Third Reich to retreat, the new offensive came from the south to corner them and make the Axis troops divide, relieving the pressure in Normandy. At 8 a.m. that day, the U.S. 517th Parachute Regiment arrived in France with 2,500 men aboard 180 C-47 aircraft and was greeted by the violent scene of war. Beyond the hostile welcome, this was not an unfamiliar scenario for this airborne division that had been created in March 1943, specifically to be part of the combat during World War II. The parachute units were formed with volunteers who were selected and trained at Camp Taqua in the mountains of northeast Georgia, United States. After preparation, the team traveled to its first deployment in a key overseas point, Italy. The 517th Parachute Regiment moved by ship and arrived at the port of Naples on May 31st, 1944. Upon arrival, the soldiers walked down the gangplanks to the waiting train cars and were transferred to the suburbs of Bagnoli, where they were ready for the attack, from Valmontone to Rome the next day. The troops were ready to go, but since the weapons, artillery, and crew vehicles had been loaded separately, they would have to operate only with rifles. This complicated the mission, which ended up being canceled. The soldiers set up camp in the crater, a place located inside an inactive volcano, in the hope of staying hidden, and they remained there until June 14. They had already received their equipment, were armed and prepared for action in a new Italian destination to which they had been assigned, Civitavecchia. During their first engagement, they suffered between 40 and 50 casualties, but managed to inflict many more on their rivals. Over the next 7 days, they maintained a continuous advance, where the Germans tried to carry out a retreat, but were caught by force. The American deployment was a success and allowed them to continue on their way to other towns where enemy troops were concentrated. This is how they reached the hilltop village of Montesarchio, which ended up being captured by the Americans. Later, they moved through Montepascali against slight resistance and continued on until they took Sticiano, managing to capture 14 Axis prisoners. The conquest continued to accumulate until the end of June, when the 517th Parachute Regiment was put into reserve. At that time, a new destination arose in their path. Provence awaited them. This is how we returned to French lands, where the airborne unit was part of the landing in the Mediterranean region that was named Operation Dragoon. The launch from the planes was the first challenge faced by the soldiers due to the bad weather that accompanied the scene. However, that was only the beginning, since the dispersal suffered by the troops was not exactly a matter of life or death. What could truly be lethal was the fierce German resistance that awaited them on the ground. The landing in Provence had a key strategic objective, which was to establish a second front in Western Europe, to create problems for the Nazis, who already had to deal with the battle in Normandy, decimating their forces. However, the mission did not end there. The Allies also sought to secure the ports of Toulon and Marseille to facilitate the entry of supplies and troops in support of operations against Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. Finally, the attrition of the enemy was the last point on the list, since by forcing the Germans to divide to face 2 attacks, the amount of resources for each combat would be less. This would allow them to be closer to a victory on French soil and begin to advance towards Berlin for the Führer's head. The 517th Parachute Regiment was also accompanied by other American, British, and French units that participated in the operation, dropping from the skies into strategic areas where they had to secure key points and disorganize the Nazi defenses. Their objectives were bridges, roads, and positions in the German rearguard, which would facilitate the advance of the ground troops made up of the 7th United States Army that would arrive through an amphibious landing. Despite the initial resistance, the American unit managed to overcome the battle against the enemy. Small groups that managed to unite after dispersing upon landing were able to cause great damage to Hitler's forces and quickly ventured into the interior of Provence. On August 27th, they secured Toulon, and a day later, Marseille. Gunfire multiplied in every corner of the cities, indicating that the Allies were approaching, and those who had occupied the territory of France were slowly falling. By September, almost the entire region was already under the control of the forces of the United States and its partners. Operation Dragoon resulted in the liberation of a large part of the south of the country from German rule, facilitating the connection with the forces advancing from the north. The recovered ports also became vital for the supply of troops and the continuation of missions on the Western Front. However, despite the fact that the enemy had also been weakened, the road was still long towards the capital of the Third Reich, and many obstacles awaited the 571st Regiment on the journey, threatening the lives of the brave soldiers.
Il est parti.
Yeah, I think he's gone.
Leaving Provence behind, the paratrooper unit had lost 19 men and 126 wounded, but they had no plans to stop. They continued onward, leaving their mark across southern France in the Allied advance. In particular, the 517th Regiment faced small battles in every town they passed through. One of these was in Monaco, where they liberated the town from the few remaining Germans after a naval bombardment. They also worked to strengthen defensive positions in and around Paracava. They built trenches and prepared a 24-kilometer front to prevent a German counteroffensive. Although the place was poorly manned by Allied troops, they managed to use mines and other explosive traps to compensate for the lack of men. However, the brutality of the war brought more casualties to the unit, which ended its participation in the region on November 17, 1944, with 102 soldiers killed in action. However, it would not be long before this team returned to the field. The U.S. 517th Parachute Regiment, which had been placed in reserve in the city of Soissons, already in the northern region of France, was called to participate in the Battle of the Bulge, when the Allies were overwhelmed by the fierce and last great offensive of the German army during World War II. The confrontation had begun on December 16, 1944, and took place in the area of extensive forests and hills that covers parts of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The peculiarity of the Nazi attack was that their rivals were taken totally by surprise, and Hitler's troops advanced on the weakest positions of the Americans. At a disadvantage, the Airborne Corps arrived as reinforcements 5 days after the German attack, acted quickly, and soon joined the fighting. The Nazi armor had made the situation difficult to control. It was impossible to determine exactly where the enemy front began under tank fire, and the main objective of the Americans was to withdraw their rivals from the high ground that gave them a strategic advantage. The task became almost impossible, and to avoid a high number of casualties from the attack of tanks and automatic weapons, Uncle Sam's troops had to opt for Plan B and take another route to go around the area. Even so, it was not easy to advance through the battlefield, and it was necessary to fight for every inch of ground along their route.
Go left! Go left!
The SS Panzer Corps, the Nazi armored unit, achieved some conquests in the fierce fighting, causing shock in the Allied command. The fall of the city of Mannheim in Belgium during Christmas was one of the great impacts. The German forces now had a base from which they could advance northwards, towards Liège. Suddenly, the Third Reich, which seemed defeated, was filled with hopes of once again conquering territory. This situation generated concern in its rivals, and the need to act to recover that strategic place that had been lost in the fighting. The Allied authorities ordered to go for Mannheim, and the 517th Regiment was one of those chosen for such a mission, joining the 7th Armored Division to fall with all the American power on the Germans. The unit would have to cross just over 3 kilometers of terrain, covered in snow and undergrowth in the dark, before reaching the starting line for the operation. The attack would begin at 2:15 a.m. on December 26th, after a 10-minute bombardment by 8 artillery battalions. Everything was ready, and the offensive proceeded as planned, after 5,000 rounds of shells were fired. By 3:30 a.m., every last pocket of resistance had been eliminated. A light counterattack was repulsed half an hour later, and the objective was finally achieved. With the confidence that had been gained by recovering the city of Mannheim, the following days were positive for the Allies, and the 517 Regiment led different attacks towards the south, in the zone of France. The Nazis refused to surrender and fought with great brutality until the last moment, causing casualties in the American and French forces that accompanied them. The heat of war was met with extremely low temperatures in January 1945. This meant that weapons required maintenance, and the engines of trucks and armored vehicles had to be started every half hour to prevent fuel from freezing. However, although some attacks were suspended due to snowstorms, the offensive continued on both sides. The American advance in the south was taking place at a rate of 1 kilometer per day, with the 517th Regiment taking the lead. The majority of the German forces began to execute a successful retreat, fighting long enough to escape the battle zone. Even a large part of the armored vehicles were abandoned in order to prioritize the lives of the soldiers. On 7th January 1945, Hitler agreed to the return of all forces that had been sent to the Ardennes, thus ending the offensive operations of the Third Reich. However, heavy fighting continued for about another 3 weeks, and the last German units involved in the fighting did not return to their original line until 25th January. After those clashes, World War II began to turn decisively in favor of the Allies. However, the Nazi resistance was still to generate some brutal battles on the road to Berlin. One of them was the fight that took place in the town of Schmidt, where the 517th Parachute Regiment of the United States was to advance to the Kleinau-Bergstein area to relieve the elements of the 8th Infantry Division and attack south during the darkness of February 5th to seize a hill on which the Germans had prepared strong defenses. After dark, the unit moved into attack position. At 500 or 600 meters from the objective, they encountered minefields and barbed wire. The soldiers tried to advance by crawling and groping in the darkness, but all efforts were useless. The men were blown into the air by the explosives. Later, with support, a new attempt to reach the Third Reich positions was thwarted by fierce machine gun fire, and the same scene was repeated twice more until the 517th Regiment was relieved by the 508th Infantry Regiment. After that experience, the paratrooper team was transported by truck to the train station in Aachen, Germany. After a 2-day train ride, it reached Laon in French territory, where it stayed for a few days. Finally, on February 15th, the 18th Airborne Corps notified the unit that it had been assigned to a newly arrived division and was to travel to Joigny, 110 kilometers from Paris. Among the plans contemplated for these soldiers was Operation Varsity, which involved an airborne crossing of the Rhine River, and Operation Coronet, the airborne invasion of the Japanese islands. However, it never reached its destination, as on 21 February 1945, while traveling to Joigny, the 517th Parachute Regiment was disbanded. Despite never seeing action again, the unit was formally deactivated in 1946, just 33 months after its creation. However, despite its relatively short life, members of this parachute combat team received a Medal of Honor, 6 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Legions of Merit, 131 Silver Stars, 631 Bronze Stars, 2 Air Medals, 4 Soldiers' Medals, 17 French Croix de Guerre, and 1,576 Purple Hearts, at the cost of 252 officers and men killed in action. Imagine descending from an amphibious boat only to be immediately greeted by thousands of cartridges burying themselves in the sand. Your comrades are just as terrified as you are, some so much that they can't move from fear. The rain of projectiles annihilates hundreds of people in seconds, their bodies falling riddled with lead. Gradually, the seawater turns red with the blood of your fellow soldiers. This might sound like a scene from a war movie, but it is what over 2 million Allied troops experienced during the Normandy landings, the offensive that condemned the Third Reich. In this military history feature, we want to reconstruct the events of those fateful days, bathed in blood and machine gun cartridges. It will be a colorful journey like you've never seen before. Let's begin with this spectacular video. The Normandy landings were the culmination of a long process that began in June 1940. At that time, the Battle of France ended with a victory for the Third Reich. This was considered by Adolf Hitler as the most famous victory in history. After a rapid advance that devastated the French army, German troops marched across French soil like kings, dominating one of the most important nations on the continent.
6 a.m., June the 28th. Hitler enters the defeated French capital.
Within barely 6 weeks of heroic struggle, our soldiers have ended the war in the West. Their deeds will enter into history as the most glorious victory of all time.
After this event, and the rescue of British troops who had been trapped in Dunkirk, the military leaders of the United Kingdom came to a grim conclusion. Even with the help of other Commonwealth nations and the United States, it would not be possible to liberate continental Europe in the near future. The Third Reich had won the first major round of World War II. After the Nazis began their invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Joseph Stalin began pressing the Allies to open a second front in Western Europe, which would significantly weaken the Third Reich. Winston Churchill dismissed the idea because, even with American support, he felt that the British lacked the necessary forces for such a large-scale offensive and wanted to avoid potentially disastrous frontal assaults. Nevertheless, Stalin's proposal was inevitable.
But secret planning for a major assault on Western Europe has begun in earnest. Throughout 1943, the Allied leaders meet in a series of conferences to plan the route to victory.
The decision to invade northern France across the English Channel was made during the Trident Conference, held in May 1943 in Washington. Churchill preferred that the Allied push focus from the Mediterranean, but this proposal was rejected by the Americans, who were providing most of the troops and material. British Lieutenant General Frederick E. Morgan was appointed Chief of Staff, that is, Supreme Allied Commander, with the important mission of devising a detailed plan. Operation Overlord was the name assigned to the ambitious project that, if successful, would represent the largest amphibious assault in history. But prior to the landing, and with the goal of achieving the necessary air superiority to ensure success, the Allies planned a bombing campaign. Its aim was to destroy German aircraft production, fuel supplies, and airfields. Thus, communication infrastructures, roads, and railways were bombed to isolate northern France and hinder the Third Reich's ability to send reinforcements. These attacks were orchestrated in a scattered manner to avoid giving precise clues about the landing locations. Additionally, impressive diversionary maneuvers were planned to prevent the Nazis from discovering the place and date of the Allied offensive. In war, surprise is undoubtedly the best weapon.
Britain becomes a vast military camp in preparation for Operation Overlord. Allied troops gather from Poland, France, Canada, and the United States. The long wait begins.
Between April 1944 and the landing, the Allied Expeditionary Air Force conducted 3,200 reconnaissance flights. Low-altitude photographs were taken of the coast to map the terrain, obstacles on the beaches, and defensive structures like bunkers and machine gun nests. To avoid giving clues to the Germans about the exact location, the flights were spread along the entire Atlantic coast of Europe. Aerial images were also captured inland of bridges, military unit locations, and buildings, often from different angles to gather as much information as possible. The Normandy coast was divided into 17 sectors, each given a code name using a word alphabet. From Able, west of Omaha Beach, to Roger on the eastern flank of Sword Beach. When the invasion plan was expanded to include the Cottonton Peninsula and Utah Beach, 8 more sectors were added. These coastal sections were further divided into beaches identified by colors: green, red, and white. Before moving on to the brutal battles, let's briefly review the objectives of each force. The initial mission was to capture the towns of Caen, Carentan, Isigny, and Bayeux, and then advance inland to eliminate German soldiers. The Americans assigned the dangerous Utah and Omaha beaches, prioritized isolating the Cotentin Peninsula and capturing the port facilities of Cherbourg. The British, through Sword and Gold beaches, and the Canadians, on Juno Beach, were to capture Caen, establish airfields nearby, and create a battlefront to protect the American flank. Washington estimated that the fighting would last for 3 months and the operation would end when all forces reached the Seine River. To achieve this, constant training in amphibious operations was crucial.
Rehearsals and training for an amphibious and airborne assault are endless. Fears about the real thing grow as the weeks pass.
The concerns of the young Allied soldiers were justified, as they faced an unrelenting enemy. The Nazi armed forces, known as the Wehrmacht, had 50 divisions deployed in France and the Netherlands, and another 18 in Denmark and Norway. 15 more divisions were being assembled in Germany, but there was no strategic reserve to defend Normandy. Combat casualties throughout the war, particularly against the Soviet Union, had left Hitler's country without young men to recruit. Many of the soldiers stationed by the Third Reich in Normandy were Ostlegionen, or Eastern Legions, made up of recruits or volunteers from Turkestan, Russia, Mongolia, and other areas. They were armed with captured equipment and lacked motorized transport. Units that arrived later, such as the 12th SS Panzer Division of the Hitler Youth, were mostly composed of better equipped and trained youths compared to the rest of the troops stationed along the coast. After a year of planning the operation, D-Day, that is, the landing day, was marked on the calendar for June 5th. It was considered the most likely date to have calm waters, a full moon, and low tide with the first rays of sunlight. However, storms forced a one-day delay, so the troops finally mobilized on June 6th. Starting at 6:30 a.m., the first 5 assault divisions were taken to beaches protected in the rear by naval gunfire. The power of the cannons shattered the silence of a calm morning, turning it into a true hell. The collaboration of the Royal Navy was crucial. Initially, the cannons damaged the German positions, destroying several bunkers and stations from which they could fire at the coast. Then, once the waves of troops began to land, the fire continued to cover the men and allow them to plant their flag on those perilous sands. Omaha, the best defended sector, was assigned to the 1st U.S. Infantry Division, supplemented by other troops. There, they faced a brutal opponent, the 352nd Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht. Strong sea currents forced many landing craft to disembark east of their intended points, which seriously complicated the assembly of the troops once they hit the shore. Due to the relentless fire coming from the tops of the cliffs, the casualties on this beach far exceeded the sum of those recorded in the rest of the operation.
Barely on the beach, the men were greeted by an almost intact German defense.
It was like a turkey shoot.
The German resistance was brutal. American soldiers disembarked from the Higgins boats, but were met with a hail of bullets coming from the dunes. There, hidden, were thousands of Germans equipped with artillery, mortars, and MG-42 machine guns. In the early moments of the landing, desperate situations arose. The soldiers were unclear on how to escape the fire. Once they hit the sand, they found themselves in a shooting gallery where they were the prey. They had to run to find some form of cover from which to plan their next move. The scene was stained with the blood of fallen men. It was a hellish panorama. Problems navigating the coastal obstacles led to a halt in the arrival of new landing craft at 8:30 a.m. Around that time, a group of destroyers approached to provide artillery support. The capture of this beach was only possible through 5 ravines, and by the end of the morning, only about 600 men had reached the higher ground. The rest had been brutally annihilated. By noon, when the naval bombardment had taken its toll and the Germans were running out of ammunition, the Americans managed to clear some paths. However, the objectives set for the first day of the invasion were not achieved until 3 days later. It is no wonder that Omaha became a symbol of the sacrifice of the troops and the suffering they endured to defeat the Third Reich. Despite the complications and with much blood and sweat, the Americans captured a precarious beachhead that they expanded with determination in the following days. Every meter was fiercely contested. The initial advance was slow and painful, making those first days after the landing seem endless. Meanwhile, on Gold Beach, the story was quite different. Strong winds complicated the arrival of Allied troops, and the amphibious tanks landed near the coast, though the plan was to do so at more distant points. Air attacks had not managed to destroy the Le Hamel fortification, and its powerful 75mm cannon continued firing until 4 p.m., though it gradually ran out of ammunition. The constant arrival of reinforcements overwhelmed any attempt at defense by the Germans. On the western flank, the Royal Hampshire Regiment captured the town of Arromanches and, on its eastern side, established contact with Canadian forces. Slowly, that pincer's movement began to close. The landing on Juno Beach was delayed due to rough seas, and the troops arrived before the anti-artillery protection ships, which led to enemy fire, causing numerous casualties among the soldiers as they disembarked. Like at Omaha, these men were at the mercy of German shooters who unleashed hundreds of rounds in a matter of seconds. It was such a slaughter that the Allies themselves had to move the bodies of their fallen comrades to advance and avoid being buried under Nazi lead. In total, 961 Allied soldiers died on Juno Beach, a significantly lower number than Omaha, but still painful. Canadian forces quickly cleared the beach and created 2 exits to the nearest inland towns. Although the delay in capturing Bagny-sur-Mer caused a bottleneck on the coast, by nightfall, the territory occupied by the Allies covered 19 kilometers in width and extended 7 kilometers inland. It was a dagger pointing straight at the heart of occupied Europe. On August 8, 1944, the Germans launched a counterattack with the intention of destroying the Allied troops. But this turned out to be a fatal decision. Due to calculation errors, 50,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were trapped, surrounded by enemies and the cold waters of northern France. Many were killed or captured by US troops. According to the original plans, the main slaughter was supposed to occur on D-Day, June 6, 1944, but it ultimately happened later, in the interior of France.
The banks wearing their steel helmets while this terrific barrage goes on around us. In this barrage, we've got our 4.2-inch mortars, our field guns, our medium guns, all the guns of the fleet. The shells are whistling overhead now. Just listen to them.
It was at this stage of Operation Overlord that British casualties exceeded 80% of the estimates provided by the High Command. Churchill, engulfed in anguish, began to wonder if there would be an army left standing when the Allies reached Berlin. The most terrifying aspect was that among the primary causes of casualties was combat fatigue, now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. On the Allied side, the number of cases was very high, with around 30,000 affected in just the 1st U.S. Army. In contrast, American and British military psychiatrists were perplexed by how so few German prisoners seemed to suffer from combat fatigue. Despite the intense bombings they had been enduring for some time, they suspected it was due to Nazi indoctrination, which began during adolescence. Nevertheless, the Reich's defenses were not sufficient to contain the power of the Allied advance.
This is the BBC Home Service. D-Day has come. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
On August 15th, with a firm presence on French soil, the Allies launched an invasion of southern France, Operation Dragoon. From that moment, their advance was virtually unstoppable. The German units lacked the equipment and energy to withstand the fury of hundreds of thousands of allies, eager for revenge for so many defeats across Europe. On August 25th, the historic liberation of Paris took place, with Reich forces retreating through the Seine River Valley after a week, ending their occupation of the City of Lights. Thus, Operation Overlord concluded, and the first nail was driven into the coffin of Nazi Germany. From D-Day to August 21st, the Allies transported 2,052,299 men to northern France. The cost in lives of the Normandy campaign was very high for both sides. Between June 6th and the end of August, U.S. forces suffered 20,668 deaths. During the same period, the casualties for the 1st Canadian Army and the 2nd British Army were 15,995 and 9,054 missing, respectively. The losses among the German armed forces deployed in France were brutal, with 158,930 deaths recorded between D-Day and August 14th. In total, estimates of German casualties in the Normandy campaign, including dead, wounded, and captured, range between 400,000 and 600,000 troops. These were the terrified faces of those who survived that nightmare. The Normandy landing was the largest maritime invasion in history, involving nearly 5,000 landing craft, 289 escort ships, and 277 minesweepers. These figures highlight the commitment of the Allied nations to defeating their common enemy. By opening the new front requested by Stalin, the operation accelerated the end of World War II in Europe and led to the transfer of numerous German troops from the east. With the Russians to the east and the United States to the west, Hitler was caught between a rock and a hard place. Additionally, the defeat in France was a tremendous moral blow to the German army, which had long feared the repetition of another two-front war similar to World War I. The Allied victory in Normandy was due to several factors. First, the German defenses were not completed by the time of the invasion. Moreover, the diversionary maneuvers proved effective and forced the Germans to prepare defenses over a vast stretch of coast, diluting Hitler's forces. As a result, the Allies immediately achieved and maintained air superiority, preventing the Wehrmacht from monitoring preparations in Britain and utilizing the Luftwaffe to interfere with their development. The Wehrmacht also suffered from indecision and an excessively complex command structure, which further contributed to its ineffectiveness. Finally, the morale of the Allied soldiers was noteworthy. They came to Normandy knowing it was a pivotal moment in World War II. Hundreds of thousands of young men gave their lives without hesitation, and their efforts were rewarded with a victory that will forever remain in the history books. And so, we come to the end. If you are passionate about these topics and want to continue discovering the most important events of the 20th century, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications for our channel to stay updated on each of our releases. With that, we bid you farewell until the next military history video. Thank you for joining us.